Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pezayin. It's for the seventh day of Pesach. Chag Sameach to everyone. We're going to get started. We're in the middle of the Mishnah about the wine and what were the requirements for the wine for the libations. So now we're up to the very bottom of Pei Vav Amud Bet. Ve'eno mivim mipiha mipnei hakmachim. You can't take from the top of the barrel because of the foam that forms at the top. Ve'lo mishuleha, not from the bottom mipnei hashmarim, because you have all the dregs at the bottom. Ela mivim mishlisha me'emtza'a. Okay, there's different interpretations of what this means. You bring from the middle third, but some people think that means the middle of the middle third section, which means that you only really get a small amount from every barrel that is able to be used as libations in the temple. Ketzadu bodik. Now, how do you check when you're pouring that you don't end up with any dregs in it? Hagizbar yosheva kaneb yado. We have someone in charge, and they sit there holding a reed in their hand. Zarak hagir, as soon as the white foamy stuff starts getting in there, or really it's the start, it's not the foamy part, it's really the stuff from the bottom, the sediment at the bottom. He kish bekaneh. So he smacks the reed, and then the person pouring knows to stop. We'll see in the Gemara why don't they just say stop? Okay, why they have to hit with the reed. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, sheyesh bo kmachim pasul. If it has, the wine in general has any sort of foam on it, you can't use the wine at all. Forget about even from the middle. Why? Shneimot mimim yu lachem umin chatam, which is actually two psukim. First pasuk ends mimim yu lachem, where it's talking about the animals and the sacrifices. This is in Bamidbar Kafchet when it goes through the sacrifices, verses 19 to 20. So the end of the first pasuk is mimim yu lachem. Then it continues, which means they have to be whole, right, without any blemished, unblemished animals. And then it says umin chatam in the next pasuk. First of all, it starts with vav, so it connects it to the previous. That also the menachot have to be perfect, and therefore they can't have any of this foam in it. Tmimim yulachem v'niskehem in pasuk lamed aleph in that same chapter. It says also the word tmimim together with their nisachim, and from there we learn not just the mincha, also the libations, which is the wine. Okay, the Gemara starts off with a quote from earlier in the Mishnah. You can't bring not sweet wine, not cooked wine, and not smoked wine, and if you do, it's disqualified. Vakatani Resha, but wait, doesn't it say before that? What is halistion? Sun-dried grapes, which are sweetened by the sun. So they're sweet. Okay, so far that sounds okay. But then it says v'mevi kasher, but if you brought them, it's actually fine. Meaning you shouldn't bring it ideally, but if you did, it works. And here it says if you did, it doesn't work. So sweeten, right? First it says sweet wine doesn't work, and there it says sweet wine does work. I shouldn't say first. First was the helistion, but the first one we quoted here. So we're going to have two answers. Amar Ravina, kroch utznei, put the two together, meaning they both have the same halacha. Okay, it was just a mistake. And then the commentaries obviously debate which one. Is it that they're more like the matok, which is it's all disqualified, or it's actually okay b'di'evet, if you did it anyway. So there's a debate about which way it goes. Rav Ashi Amar, no, keep the original version. There's a difference between sun-dried and grapes that are naturally sweet. Chulia de shimsha, if it's sweet from the sun, lo mais, that's not disgusting. So ideally you shouldn't use it, but if you did, it's fine. Chulia de pera mais, but if it's sweet, the fruits themselves are sweet, it's not going to make for a good wine. So back to this machloket in the Mishnah about old wine. So now we want to really understand what's Rebbe's opinion about. We're going to have one explanation, and then we're going to ultimately reject it and pick a different explanation as to why Rebbe says, don't bring old wine. Amar Chizkiah. So Chizkiah brings the first answer. My time de Rebbe. What's the reason? Amar Kra, the pasuk says, lakeves yayin. So now, okay, this is a pasuk which talks about the korbanot. Again, it's in Bamidbar, chapter 28. V'niskehem chatziyahin yelapal shishirayin la'ayil. We'll come back to these at the end of Daf, which is right half a hin for the par of oil, shlishirahin of wine. Sorry, a third of a hin for the ram, a quarter of a hin for the keves, yayin. Okay, and they want you to know we're talking about wine. Now, the placement of the word yayin in the pasuk is a little bit strange. Okay, because it says. It could have said niskehem yayin chatziyahin. So why does it put it right next to the word keves, the sheep? It's to tell you ma keves ben shnato, af yayin ben shnato. Just like the keves has to be within its first year, also the wine needs to be within its first year. So now they say, right, because the keves for these korbanot has to be within its first year. So now, right, for korban ola. So now they say, wait a minute. Ima keves ben shtei shanim pasul, Af yayin ben sheshani pasul. If we're really going to learn it from the sheep, then we're going to say just like the sheep, if you use the wrong year, it's going to be disqualified. So likewise, if you use the wine that's too old, it's going to be disqualified. Now, that could be true, but now we're going to bring a braita where we're going to have to, doesn't say it's Rebbe's opinion, but we're going to assume, we're going to prove it's Rebbe. And then we're going to see that it says that if you use it anyway, it's okay. And that's going to reject Chizkiah's explanation. Because if you really learn it from the sheep, then we're going to assume that it's just like the sheep and is completely disqualified. So if you want to say, maybe you're right, bench time, yayin also that's 2 years old is going to be ruined, is going to be disqualified if you use it. Well, Hatanya, look at this braita. It says in a braita, yayin ben shte shanim lo yavi, v'mevi kasher. So it starts off with 2-year-old wine, can't bring. But if you did bring, it's okay. Man shamat, now, we have to prove it's Rebbe. How do we know it's Rebbe? Well, man shamat le damar lo yavi, Rebbe. The only one who says you can't bring 2-year-old wine is Rebbe, because remember, Rebbe says yayin yashan is no good, and the rabbis say it's completely good. So this source must be Rebbe, and kamal v'mevi kasher. And said there, if he brings, it's kasher. So therefore, we reject Chizkiah's explanation. Now we're going to go with Rava. Ela amar Rava, hainu tamid Rebbe dichtiv al teri yayin ki et adam. So now we're going to quote this pasuk, which is very famous because it's a pasuk that's used to basically prove, or not to prove, but to support those who say you should be using red wine for Kiddush. It comes from this pasuk. It's actually a strange context because it's a pasuk in Mishlei, basically saying beware of wine because wine can make you turn to white. Wine is red, and basically the red wine is the good wine, and that's the wine that's going to make you turn away, basically, by go do bad things. So, but yet what they're going to say is, what do you see here? The real wine is red. And that's why people say for Kiddush, ideally you should use red wine. There's many who use white wine, and it's not like you have to. Okay, there's also different opinions about that. But, and apropos Pesach, right, in terms of also people try Leila Seder specifically to use red wine. But again, not everybody does. But there's much more of an issue to use red wine. But in any case, what do you see here? What does this have to do with anything? Well, the wine apparently gets lighter when it gets older. So that's why ideally you shouldn't use wine that's older, according to Rebbe, because it's already paled in color. But that's also why it's not so bad if you use it anyway. Okay, and that explains Rebbe in the end. And what they're really quoting here is after that, it says you have to bring from the kramim ha'avudim. You should bring from the ones that you hoed. Tana. Now, Braita says kramim avudim pamayim b'shana, specifically ones that were hoed twice a year. Once a year is not enough. Now we're going to hear a story. Rav Yosef Havale Karna de Pardesa. He had a corner of an orchard, or it was really probably a vineyard. De Rafik Beit Fei Rivka. He did an extra hoeing. Va'avid Chamra Didare Maya al Chad train. He made such good wine that they had to dilute it with twice the amount of water. Lo hayu konsim oto b'chatzavim gdolim. Tana chaviyot kadiyot ludiyot benoniot. So now they say that what kind of barrels would they use? Okay, they wouldn't use the big ones, they would use smaller ones. What are these smaller ones? They say they're chaviyot, they're barrels that are kadiyot, they're actually flasks, ludiyot benoniot. They come from lod and they're average size. You shouldn't leave them one, meaning, you shouldn't leave them two next to each other. You should leave them separate, echad. Why? Because if one gets ruined, then the other ones are going to get ruined as well. Okay. In other words, let's say there's goes bad. Well, if it's next to the other one, it might be affected by the wine. Ketzab bodek. So how would they check? Gizbar yoshev kaneh biyado zarak hagir hikish bakaneh. That was what we said, right? When the guy starts to see the bad stuff is coming in, takes the reed and hits it. Tana, so the Braita says, Zarak hagir shel shmarim, when the sediment at the bottom starts coming, Gizbar yikish bakaneh, so he knocks with his reed. Okay, so now they say, why don't they just say, stop? Misayele Rabbi Yochanan, this supports Rabbi Yochanan, Da'amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kishem shadibor yafel b'samim, kach dibor ra liyayin. Just like speech is good for the besamim. When they would make the pitum ketoret, they would say the words hadek heteve tevadek, and that would be right to crush it well crush it. And that would be a way that they would speak to the spices because that would make it better. Okay, this is, I think it's the way people speak to their plants, right? They say speak to your plants. Not that I've tried it, but people do say that. It's good for the plants, so it's good for spices, but it's really bad for wine. That's why they didn't want to speak around the wine because it would ruin the wine. Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda Omer. By Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan asked, Hikdisho maushil kela mishum malmu. Okay, this is like the questions we saw by Rabba or Rava, and some people actually changed the nusach to say this is actually Rabba who asked the question, not Rabbi Yochanan. Just like we asked by the previous sections, if you remember, we're in a series of sections talking about where was the best sola from and what's good and what's not in the wine, and right, we had all and the oil. So now he asked, what if you sanctify something that's disqualified? So Maushil kala mishum ba'amom, you're going to get lashes for bringing right something that's blemished on the altar. Kevan de pasul kebal mum, since it's disqualified, is it like a blemished animal? Or maybe blemishes are only by animals, and just like every other time we ask this question, we end with teku. We don't have an answer. Tanu Rabbanan. Elim mimoav, fasim michevron, agalim misharon, gozalot mehar melech. Okay, this is where they would bring the animals from, just like we saw before, where they bring the wine, where they bring the soda, where they bring the oil. This is where they would bring the different animals from. So the rams came from Moab, the sheep came from Hebron, the calves came from the Sharon, and the gozalot, the birds, came from Har HaMelech. Har HaMelech are apparently mountains outside Jerusalem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mivi'im kvasim shegovhan kiruchban. They would bring sheep whose height was the same as their width, meaning they were very wide and fat and plump animals. Amar Rava bar of Shila, my Talmud Rabbi Yehuda, where did he get this from? Tichtiv yireh miknecha bayom hahu kar nirchav. Okay, your flock will graze on that day. They will be wide. Okay, like a kar nirchav, they would be an animal that's very wide. Ktiv, okay, another pasuk. Achomotayich Yerushalayim ifkadeti shomrim kol hayom v'chol halayla. Tamid lo yechashu. We're ending this chapter. We're about to end it. We're ending it with like a nice kind of statement about the future and the redemption. So it says, on the walls of Jerusalem, I put shomrim, guards, kol hayom v'chol halayla, all day and all night. Tamid lo yechashu. They will not be silent. Hamaskirim et Hashem. They're always mentioning God's name. Al dami lachem. They shouldn't be silent. So now they say, my Amre, what do they say? If they're not supposed to be silent, then what are they saying? So they say, Ahachi Amar Rava bar Shila, and this is why this comes up here, because we were just talking about something Rava bar Shila said, Atata kum tirachem Sion, and the continuation, Ki eit lechenena kiva moed, if you know the song, right? You will get up and, right, have rachamim on Zion, and because now the time has come. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem. You can imagine why they're ending the chapter with this, because they're talking about, I mean, specifically it would be better if we're at the end of Menachot, but it's this idea of, we want to go back to the days when we had a temple. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says they would say Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem, Nidchei Yisrael Yechanes. I'm reading the rest of the pasuk, right? Where God would gather all the people who were exiled and rebuild Jerusalem. And now they ask me, Karamayava Amre, but what were the guards on the walls of Jerusalem saying before this all happened? Right, before the destruction. Because God chose Zion, it is the beautiful dwelling, right? It was his dwelling place. And with that, Hadran alach kol korbanot et tzibur, and we will continue on to the next chapter. So the next chapter is going to start out with the measuring implements that were in the temple. Okay, I'll remind you, we're in the 10th chapter now. If you remember in the Mishnah, the 6th chapter appears as the 10th chapter, right? It's out of order. So that chapter really seems to belong here. But now we're moving on with what we're up to now. So there were 2 dry measuring utensils. Isaron v'chatzi isaron. One was an isaron, as we saw, to measure the menachot, and there was a chatzi isaron. We're going to talk about what that was for very shortly. Rabbi Meir Omer, there were 3. Okay, he doesn't say the word number 3, but he's going to count right now 3 of them. Isaron, isaron, v'chatzi isaron. This sounds a little strange. There's one isaron, there's another isaron, and there's a chatzi isaron. So measuring, you have, right, like in your house, you might have 2 1-cup measuring cups. So there were 2 isaron, quarter, right, a tenth of an ephah measuring cups, and 1 chatzi isaron. Isaron mahayam shamesh. So what was the purpose of the isaron? Shabo yamodeh l'chol menachot, because all the menachot have an isaron in them, or maybe more, and we're going to see, they would measure. If you have for the par, let's say you need 3 esronim, so you measure the isaron 3 times. And that's what we're going to say right now. Lo haya modeh b'shel shlosha lepar, for the bull offering, when you need three, you didn't measure it in a 3-cup measuring cup. V'lo b'shel shnayim la'ayil, and not 2 for the ayil. Ela modedan esronot. You would just do it as however many esronot you need. Chatzi isaron mehayam shemesh. What was the purpose of the half isaron? Rabbi Meir, Shabo haya moded chavitei Kohen Gadol mechze baboker umechze ben arba'im, because the Kohen Gadol, his griddle cake offering, if you remember, needs to be half an isaron in the morning and half an isaron in the afternoon. We're going to get to exactly how that was measured out very shortly. So now the Gemara starts off with a bright Tanya. Haya Rabbi Meir omer, matzamul lomar isaron lekeves echad. What is it when it says isaron lekeves echad? What does it mean? Milamed. Why does it say isaron? It's just one isaron for the keves. Why do you say isaron twice? Okay, these psukim, right now we're going to jump around to psukim in chapters 28 and 29 of Bamidbar, where all the sacrifices are mentioned. This is the one for Shavuot, and it said isaron for each of the kvasim. Milamed shtei esronot hayu b'mikdash. Why does it double the word isaron? Repeat it, to say there are 2 utensils called the isaron. Echad gadush ve'echad machuk. Now we're going to see the difference between them, right? You might have just thought, okay, they just had 2, right? Some people say maybe you would have thought one was for public and one was for individual offerings, like communal and individual. But Rabbi Meir here in this Braita gives a different reason. Echad gadush ve'echad machuk. It's a little bit strange for anyone who cooks in the kitchen with measuring utensils. One is, if you measure a 1-cup measuring cup, okay, in this case, 1 isaron. If you fill it and flatten it, right, the way you usually use measuring utensils, that's machuk. And then it'll be exactly an isaron. The other one, to get to an isaron, you have to overflow it. A little bit strange, right? Have it heaping. So the commentaries say this is because we want it to look like you're being generous about your mincha. So that's why we have it heaping. And we're going to have to understand why do we have some why some need to be measured in the flat one. We'll see that soon. So gadush shebo hayamoded lechol menachot. So all the menachot were really done in the gadush one, the overflowing one, as we said before, to have it look like you're giving an overflowing gift to the temple. Machuk shebo hayamoded lechavitei Kohen Gadol. But the flat one, the level one, they would use for the chavitei Kohen Gadol. Why? Because they would want to split it in half. And if you're going to, first they take it in the isaron and then they split it in half into that, they're going to pour half of it into the half isaron. Now, if it's overflowing and you try to pour it, it's going to make a big mess. Okay, you're going to try to pour it into another measuring implement, it's going to make a big mess. The chachamim omrim, and we're not worried about the mess, obviously, we're worried about you losing some of it. You don't want to lose any of it. Okay, there was only 1 isaron, and he quotes a different pasuk in that section. This is in chapter 29, verse 4, about Rosh Hashanah, and there it says, V'isaron echad. We're now going to have a ping-pong back and forth with the psukim. So one uses isaron, that's Rabbi Meir, who says there's 2 things called isaron. The rabbis say, isaron echad, it says, in a different pasuk. So 1 isaron sounds like there's only 1 isaron measuring implement. So what do they do with Rabbi Meir's pasuk? The fact that it says isaron means there's 2 dry measuring implements. One is an isaron, one is a half an isaron. Rabbi Meir, chatzi isaron minale. Now, where does Rabbi Meir get chatzi isaron? Because he uses isaron for the 2 isaron ones. Nafkalemi v'isaron. Okay, now we're going back to the pasuk on Rosh Hashanah. V'isaron echad. Why did it start with vi and meant? Oh, and there's an additional one. So he doesn't learn it from the isaron pasuk. He learns it from the Rosh Hashanah pasuk. For Rabbanan, what do they do with the vav? They don't need it, so they say vav lo darshin. They don't darshin vavs. Rabbi Meir. Now we still have some more questions because what does he do with the rabbi's pasuk that prove that there's only 1 isaron? So they have to explain the isaron echad. Now they darshan the vav there, but they didn't darshan the isaron echad. Remember, this is in the same pasuk where they darshan the vav. But what do we do with isaron echad lekeves echad? Mayavid le. That's to teach you isaron echad. You use the 1 isaron for even the 2 and the 3 isaron, right? When you need 2 or 3 isaron, then you're going to use that 1 isaron measuring implement. That's the isaron echad. There's 1 isaron measuring. There isn't a 2-cup and a 3-cup. Rabbanan. Now, where are they going to learn it from? Nafkalemi nikudo. Okay, we're going to see a pasuk. Now we're going to quote a pasuk in chapter 29 also. Verse 15, where we're on the Sukkot sacrifices. And there, okay, we're going to read it right now, and then we'll explain what this nikudo is. Amar Rabbi Yossi, lama nakuv vav shebe'emtze isaron shel rishon shel yom tov rishon shel chag. On the first day of of Sukkot. It says, okay, the pasuk reads like this. V'isaron isaron lekeves echad la'arba'asar kvasim. You need an isaron each for each of the sheep. Okay, here it says isaron doubled again, but we don't darshan that. But on the first isaron, on the vav toward the end of the word, not the vav at the beginning, v'isaron, but isaron at the end, there's a vav nun. That one that they call be'emtza, the middle of the word, they just mean middle as opposed to the beginning. It's really toward the end. But that isaron had a dot on it in the Torah. So they said, what do we learn from this? The dot is coming to limit it to say this isaron is used, right? There isn't a 2 and a 3 isaron. There's just the one. The Rabbi Meir, now he learns that from the other pasuk, right? Isaron echad. So what does he do with this nikuda? Nikudo lo darish. He just didn't darshan that dot there. Okay, he didn't think there was anything to make of it. That was the back and forth, Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, and how they get to their positions of whether there was this extra isaron or not. Chatzi isaron mahayam shamesh. We're now quoting the Mishnah. What was the chatzi isaron used for? Shaboy amudei lechavitei kohen gadol. They used it for the chavitei kohen gadol. So they say modeh, they would measure the solet in that? Wait a minute. Well, wouldn't they measure it in the isaron? Ramini, this contradicts the following source. Chavitei kohen gadol lo yubaim chatzin. If you remember, he brings this whole, you don't bring half of the morning and half of the afternoon. You sacrifice half of the morning, half of the afternoon. But the kohen gadol elamevi isaron shalem, he brings a whole isaron to the temple, which means it must have been measured in the isaron first, v'chotzeu, and then splits it. Now, the way they read the Mishnah is not the way we read it. The way they read the Mishnah is the isaron is there to measure. You need a half an isaron in the morning and half an isaron at night, so in the afternoon. So measure in the half an isaron, and measure in the other one, another, right, later in the day, measure in later in the day, the other half an isaron. But here it says you measure the whole thing, and then you split it up. So I'm Rav Shesha, my moded nami dekatani mechalek. Well, when they say measure, what they really mean is split it. In other words, yes, you start with a holy isaron in the morning, and then you divide, and you make 2 doughs, one with a half isaron and one with the other half. So you use that measuring cup to measure your half an isaron. Okay, now we have a siman for 3 things that are coming up, 3 questions that Rami Bar Chama is going to ask Rav Chisda. Chatzi, chavitei, shulchan. So ba'aminei Rami Bar Chama mi Rav Chisda. Chatzi isaron Rabbi Meir. Gadush haya or machuk haya? The half an isaron of Rabbi Meir, was it gadush, was it overflowing, or was it machuk, was it flat? So now they say, right, because he said there were 2 isarons, one was flat, one was heaping. What about it was only going to be an isaron if it's heaping. What about the half? Is that an exact or not? So they say, the question, why is he asking only according to Rabbi Meir? You should ask the question also according to the rabbis. So he says, L'Rabbanan isaron gufei kamebaylahu, gadush haya machuk haya. So they say he was also wondering about that, but he asked specifically about the chetzi because according to Rabbi Meir, we know what the isaron was. One was gadush, one was machuk. He was asking about the isaron. According to the rabbis, he wanted to know, what about both of them? Were they flat, right, level, or not, or overflowing? So the answer now, the answer of Chisda gives him is, Amar le, mide Rabbi Meir nishma Rabbi Meir, mide Rabbi Meir nishma Rabbanan. From what Rabbi Meir says, we can understand what Rabbi Meir holds, and from what Rabbi Meir says, we can figure out what the rabbis hold. Because the assumption here is, whatever Rabbi Meir holds about what the Chatzi Isaron is, we assume the rabbis will agree, because we don't see that they disagree about that. We see they disagree about how many Isaron kelim they were, but we assume whatever he thinks the Chatzi Isaron, they must have agreed on that. So mide Amar Rabbi Meir Isaron machuk, Chatzi Isaron nami machuk. So the first thing they say is, listen, you're using the isaron and the chatzi isaron for the chavitei kohen gadol, and since the one you're using for the chavitei kohen gadol, that's the isaron, is level, then it must be the half one which goes with it is also level. And mid Rabbi Meir machuk, the Rabbanan nami machuk, and then we can say, okay, well, if he thinks the chatzi isaron is machuk, probably the rabbis assume that the chatzi isaron was machuk, and then the rabbis, we assume their one isaron that they had must have been also machuk, flat. Okay, level. So that was the first question about the Chatzi Isaron. Now, ba'amine Rabbi Bar Chama mi Rav Chisda. Second question he asked: Chavitei kohen gadol b'meh mechakan lechalot, b'yad or b'kli? There's a big debate exactly at what point they get split, and what we're talking about. Either the dough we're going to divide in half, half of the morning, half of the evening, and then if you remember, they made 6 loaves in the morning, 6 loaves in the evening or afternoon. But some people say we're talking about the Rambam. If you remember, says you divide the loaves. So you would take the dough balls and divide each one of them in half. Okay, so either which way, whatever you're dividing, do you divide it by hand or with a utensil. Now, when they mean a kli, they mean like a measuring kli, like a scale. Pshita de biyad, obviously by hand. Right? I would have thought the opposite. De'iba kli tortani yachnis, because if you use a vessel, what we're going to bring a scale into the temple. So the Gemara says, "V'yachnis." I don't get the problem. Yeah, sure. Bring a measuring utensil like a scale into the temple. Why not? Well, they say no. It's not appropriate because the scales are mentioned in the curses. Okay, if you look in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 26, verse 26, it says, when you're gonna break your bread, we're gonna have 10 women. Okay, 10 women will be sharing one oven. And they're going to give people back their in measurements. Okay, they're going to measure everything out. And everyone's going to get just a small measure, and then they're going to eat, and they won't be satiated. But what do you see here? The mishkal, the by weight, is mentioned here. So we don't want to bring that into the temple. It just has bad, right? It's going to lead to a curse, maybe. I mean, it's hard to understand exactly why they were worried about that, but it seems pretty clear to them we're going to do it by hand. Third question. Shulchan ma'u shekadesh kmatsim bagodesh shelo. Okay, the shulchan was where the lechem apanim was. Now it's pretty flat. There's a little bit of a rim around it, although I think there's a little bit of a debate about that rim. But the question is, what if you put a kometz on there? Okay, does it get sanctified by being placed in a sanctified vessel or not? And what would be the question? Well, midimakadesh lechem kvatsim nami makadesh. Now you're not supposed to put the kometz on the table. The table's meant for the bread, the show bread, and the biziche levona, right? The frankincense bowls. But since it sanctifies the bread, then we can assume it would also sanctify the kometz. O dilma de chazel makadesh lo chazel lo makadesh, or maybe it only sanctifies things that were supposed to be sanctified there. The table was made for the bread, not for the kometz of the mincha. Remember, also this is in the heichal. The minchas aren't supposed to go in the heichal at all. Amar le eno makadesh. So Rav Chisda answers no. To which the Gemara says, "Ini, is that really true?" V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan l'divrei Omel t'fachayim v'mechza kofel nimsa shulchan. Okay, now we're going to have this whole thing that Rabbi Yochanan says about the lechem apanim. Now, the first thing you have to know, there's this debate about the lechem apanim, about the shape of it exactly, and within the machloket about the shape, there's also machloket. There's this assumption, either which opinion you go by. We're going to see this more inside later when we get to lechem apanim. But the sides went up, okay, and it went up either 2.5 tefachs, handbreadths, or 2 each. Now, if you remember, they were stacked one on top of the other, 6 loaves in a stack. So we're going to say like this. Rabbi Yochanan said, "L'divrei ha'omer t'fachayim v'mechza kofel." The one who says it went up 2.5 t'fachim on each side. Nimtza shulchan makadesh 15 tefach lamala. So the shulchan has the power to be makadesh 15 t'fachim high because it's going to sanctify bread that's even 15 t'fachim off the bottom. Okay, because if you count 2.5 times 6, you're going to get to 15. L'divrei omer t'fachayim kofel, the one who says it was only 2 handbreadths, nimtza shulchan makadesh 12 tefach lemala. You're going to see that the table is going to go sanctify 12 tefachim only above, because 6 times 2 is 12. Very simple math, which is going to lead us to the next point, which is, if the math is so simple, then what are they telling us? So they must be telling us that the table has the power to sanctify other things, because look, you can even sanctify the bread up to that height. Sounds like anything you put above it will be sanctified, including the kometz. But Amar le, how they say, okay, so let's just go back. Rami Bar Chama said, no, it doesn't. But this source seems to say yes. Now, it's true this source wasn't really talking about, but they assume that it really does indicate. So Amar le, Rav Chisda's response, Enom kadesh l'karev, Bal mekadesh li'pasel. When it said in that source about the 2.5 and the 2 and the 12 and the 15, it was talking about it can sanctify things in order to disqualify them. They're sanctified enough to disqualify, but they're not sanctified enough to sacrifice on the altar. There's a difference. You need a better sanctification process, like the right place for it to be, rather than sticking something that doesn't belong on the shulchan in order to allow it to be sacrificed. Or allow it to be disqualified, there's a lower threshold of what kind of sanctity you need. And with that, we've solved the difficulty against Rav Chisda's answer. Now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. So we started the first Mishnah with the yavesh, the dry measuring cups. There were 2 or 3. Now we're going to say sheva midot shalach hayu b'mikdash. There were 7 liquid measuring cups. Hin, okay, which is 12 log. Chatzia hin, 6 log, half of that. Shlishit hin, a third of a hin, 4 log. Rivi'it ahin, 3 log, a quarter of a log, chatzi log, rivi'it log. Okay, there were way more of these. Okay, the next Mishnah is going to tell us what all these were used for. Okay, you might remember the rivi'it ahin is for the kevis, right? For the wine and the oil for the sheep offering, and for the sheep burnt offerings, and the shlishit is for the ayil, and the chatzi ahin is for the par, for the bull. Okay, the log was for most of the menachot. Okay, the chatzi log and the revi'ita log we're going to get to. Rabbi Eliezer bar Rabbi Tzadok Omer, he doesn't agree that there were 7 of them. He says shnatot hayu behin ad kan lepar, ad kan la'ayil, ad kan lekeves. By the way, I didn't say what the hin was used for. You'll see why in a minute. I specifically ignored it. Shnatot hayu behin. So basically, they had a one hin measuring cup, 12 log, and then they had indentations on it. And basically that would be, right, like you have liquid measuring cups at home with all these lines. And you would just measure up to the line, right? It's much easier to do that with liquid ingredients. So, ad kan lepal, ad kan la'ayil, ad kan lekeves, right? They would say, this is par, ayil, keves. Okay, instead of saying numbers, they just had it etched in there. Rabbi Shimon, and then etc. Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo haya shem hin. She says there was no hin. There wasn't a hin measuring cup. Okay, you said there were 7 and the first one was a hin? Definitely not. Because it was nothing in the mikdash that you needed to measure a hin for. Ela miday tera. Now he does agree though there were 7. So he says what the other one must be is shalog v'mechzai tasham. There was a 1.5 log. What was that for? Shebahaya moded leminchat kohen gadol. You might remember the minchat kohen gadol splits. There were 3 log, but that's to split half in the morning, half in the evening. Oil. So you would split the oil in half, and you would get a 1.5 log to measure to divide that 3 log into 2. Log v'mechza b'boker, log v'mechza bein arbaim. So again, you need 1 log and a half for the morning and 1 log and a half for the afternoon. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a brighter that sounds very similar, but you're going to see in a minute one difference. Sheva midot shalach hayu b'mikdash. There were 7 liquid measuring utensils. Revi'ita log, chatzia log, revi'ita hin, shlishita hin, chatzia hin behin. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Now he says the same as in our Mishnah, but they're a reverse order. Starts at the smaller ones, it goes to the bigger ones. Now we're going to see Rabbi Meir, who does it the same exact ones, but the same exact order as our Mishnah. The Gemara is going to say, well, what's the difference? Why does it matter if we count this way or that way? But that you'll have to wait for the next year. Rabbi Meir Omer, hin b'chatzia hin b'shlishita hin revi'ita hin log b'chatzi log revi'it log. That's exactly what we saw in the Mishnah. And then Rabbi Shimon Omer, lo hayashem hin v'chimaya hin b'shamesh. There was nothing for the hin to do. Ela et mi avienu tachtav. What will I bring in place? I'm just going a little bit into tomorrow's stuff. Ela midai terasha log b'mechzai tashem shabo yamodei l'chavitei kohen gadol. Log mechza b'boker, log mechza bein arbaim. Exactly, it's the same thing. We're going to continue this bright to continue this discussion when we get to tomorrow's stuff. Okay, so what did we do today? We basically talked about first the wine and all the different details that we saw in the Mishnah about the wine, and went into more details about them and some possible seeming maybe contradictions and more explanations of why they did things. Right? We talked about not talking to your wine, it might ruin it, and some other issues there. Then we got to the Shtei Midot Shel Yavesh, or 3, and then 7 Midot of Lach, or maybe just 1 with the indentations, and the different opinions about, where we got this machloket, were there 2 cleaves called the Nisaron, and what was the difference between them, what were they used for, and why did the rabbis not agree, and where they all get it from the psukim. And then we got to the what all the 7 liquid ones were used for, and we talked within that about the Chavitei Kohen Gadol, and whether you can split them by hand or by vessel, in the end by hand. And then we had those 3 questions Rabbi Brachama asked Rav Chisda. One about what about the Chatzi Saron? According to Rabbi Meir, was it flat or overflowing? And then they asked, what about the rabbis too? And then in the end, they said they're all flat. And then we got to these 2 other questions about the Shulchan and about the Chavitei Kohen Gadol b'yad or b'kli. Okay, with that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone Chag Sameach, and we'll meet after the Chag.